Hi, you're watching a very special session of Agenda AWANI. Thanks to Redact USM for bringing the 37th IAHR Congress. It's a congress that puts together not only engineers and people great in the technology of hydrology and stuff, but also water experts are here and a few other stakeholders. And it's a very pertinent issue to discuss, water, because everyone knows it's without water there's no civilization. But how are we governing the issue of governance of water now? Clean water, for example, in Asia Pacific, we're talking about food security and water comes together with it as an issue. So I have two great gentlemen beside me here today. Closest to me, Mr. President, Professor Peter Goodwin. Thank you so much for being here. I mean, I've heard so much, I've Googled you so much about IAHR and you, but you also have Dr. Christopher George with you. Dr. George is the Executive Director. I think in the 21st century, green is really in. The young people have even politically been pushing to make sure that their leaders would have green initiatives in mind, issues of sustainability and all else. But if we look at it, where has the governance of precious resources like water gone wrong? Because like what I asked UNESCO earlier, if the old civilization, like in Egypt or in Southeast Asia, everybody knows the World Heritage Site of Angkor Wat. There was nothing before Angkor Wat there, but they managed to align the water flow well, and they created a civilization out of it. And we all know about Egypt. So if we had that technology thousands and hundreds of years ago, why are we suffering now managing water and water flows either on the surface or below? And we have to have this kind of congress to get together and find new knowledge about it.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us and covering our World Congress, and it's great to be here. And of course, water is absolutely critical. It drives economic development, it drives strife around the world. So your question about why are we facing these challenges now? Our global water resources have never been under such external pressures. You look at the rate of population growth. If you look back in ancient time, for them it was a big challenge. But it's nothing like the urbanization we're seeing, the rapid growth in population. So the first issue is population growth and all of the things that goes with that, getting clean water to the people, and then disposing of the wastewater in an effective way. You need to feed those people, so you need irrigation water. What happens with that water after it's come off the field? It puts nutrients and other potential contaminants into our water systems. And then superimposed on that, there are other challenges like climate change. And some people will look at climate change and say, well, it's only 0.5 degrees Celsius over the next few decades. Is that a big deal? But Dr. George and I have been all over the world in the last 2 years, and almost everywhere we've been, there's either been a significant flood, the most intense rainfall ever experienced in a generation, or in the case of the UK, the last 250 years, or in the case of California, potentially the biggest drought in the last 1,000 years. So with climate change, it's not so much this gradual change, but we're seeing these much greater extremes that, of course, engineers and scientists need to manage. But it does get more complicated than that, because when water is a scarce resource, our healthy Earth system, our ecosystems, are totally also dependent on that water. So water managers are trying to balance the sustainability of the ecosystem, maintaining biodiversity for all of the benefits that that entails on one side, and then they're trying to get water to supply cities and to grow the food that we eat. So that's why we're facing these intense challenges right now.
Please allow me to take 2 steps back. This is my first IAHR World Congress, so please humor me on this. This is the first time, as a moderator and talk show anchor, that I hear engineers speaking more like Greenpeace or, like an NGO fighting for a cause. Usually if I go to a meeting of engineers or even accountants, they're so absorbed within their own technical profession. But here straight on from the onset, you've been painting the picture that the International Association for Hydro-Environment Engineering Research has single-handedly on its shoulder put the responsibility to solve all these mankind gigantic obstacles moving forward.
We hope we're part of the vanguard of the understanding that typical grey infrastructure does not solve every problem. And the more sophisticated our sensing, our understanding of the environment becomes, the more we understand. And so, yes, grey infrastructure might do some things in terms of water supply, and then it gives you problems on the environment side, which is very important to that village, that community, our society. So there's been an increasing recognition that you have to deal with both issues. In California, they passed a law called the Coequal goals, which says that you can't look at water supply without an equal amount of effort on the environment. Similarly, you can't do an environmental restoration without looking at the consequences to water supply. So what we try to do is to bring the science and engineering research to address those issues, because we recognize you can't deal with one issue without the other. So people talk about green infrastructure as alternatives, and what we're seeing with this sensing our ability to understand these solutions, that not always, but often the green infrastructure can be equally, if not more, effective for the traditional objectives while achieving many others.
Mankind will forever be debating about whether you develop an area or whether you maintain the natural ecosystem. What we want to look at in the 21st century with more data. Now we have the so-called dashboards of anything. If we were to send man to Mars, let's calculate the time. We can do that now. You know, on the computer, we practically have gone to Mars like hundreds of times. Why can't we do that for a very simple substance like water? Why can't we map it properly and govern this properly?
Well, I think we can, and one of the beautiful things about this Congress here in Kuala Lumpur is the title, which is Learning from the Past for the Future. And I think that one of the problems of engineers, sometimes we can be arrogant. The truth is we have to learn from the past. And yesterday we gave an award, or the Deputy Prime Minister gave an award to the Smart Tunnel project, which we believe, our association believes, is something innovative and helps to solve the problems that you have here in Kuala Lumpur. But we also gave our World Heritage Award to one of the oldest dams in the country. I used to live many years ago in Iraq, and I learnt from the past. There's a famous city in Iraq called Uruk, Ur, the ancient city of Ur. And when you go there, and I had the privilege to go there, it's amazing that you see, when you climb on top of one of these ziggurats, something that existed 3,500 years BC, and that civilization existed and finished 500 years BC. Why did it finish? Because the people who lived there didn't realize that irrigation can destroy the land, because the water was full of salts, and so the crops didn't grow, and eventually the whole civilization collapsed because the engineers didn't really understand the impacts or the implications of what they were doing. However, on the plus side, 4 years ago, we gave our World Heritage Awards to the Dujiangyang irrigation scheme in near Chengdu in China. Also a very, very old irrigation project, and it's still working very, very well, because the engineers knew how to marshal the water and maintain it. So I felt very proud. So I learnt a lot from the past when I lived in Iraq, and that's always stayed with me. If all engineers were to learn from the past and use that knowledge, I think we'd be better off.
You're still watching a very special recording of Agenda AWANI right here at PWTC, and I'm here thanks to Redact USM, and of course, the main organization in the world where I feel like they are actually NGOs working for a good cause like Greenpeace, because they sound like it and they put action into it. And now I have so much data on hydrology, engineering, and all this stuff, hydro environment, and I'm still here with Mr. President and Executive Director. And I know I asked a big question before, but if you can relate that to, because you have traveled around the world, it's nothing like going around the world and collecting data and making, putting the facts together. So maybe you see more than people like me who are mainly here.
When you ask the question, how do you go about managing a system when it's so incredibly complex? That all comes down, I think, to governance. How do you structure the studies so you're not just asking for an analysis of water supply or wastewater or transportation? All of these things are interconnected. So we need visionary leaders, which we're beginning to see actually in the opening address at our World Congress. It was quite clear that your Deputy Prime Minister and your Honourable Minister understood the complexities of the issues, and they're beginning to look through NARAM and other agencies here. How do you take this bigger look? How do you get connected so the data streams, the different scientists, the different engineers can come together to answer these incredibly complex questions? So we're not there yet, but I think big progress is being made, and many of the talks and sessions here, how do you protect vulnerable coastal areas to sea level rise, to water quality issues? You're beginning to see these different disciplines coming together to look at the whole, not just the engineering or the science. And I would also say most countries are beginning to look at the cultural implications too. What does it mean to the society? What does it mean to the people that live at that point? What's their quality of life if we do whatever it is? So it's new, and I think that you're seeing some great developments here in Malaysia along those lines.
I think the days where the engineer was some boffin behind looking at numbers, I think that's changing. It has to.
How crucial is the disruption of the fourth industrial revolution, as they like to call it? And Industry 4.0, of course, fits into the engineering side. If we were to ride the wave, instead of being hit by the wave, what do we do to map all this out and really sort of, rather than just a built environment, we weave into the natural environment, built into it, like precision of open cardiothoracic surgery. We go into the body, but we don't build a new heart, but we just manage it better, for example. So can I put that analogy towards what we, the layman, can expect of engineers, especially this area of engineering? Because if water is the life force, then water flows are controlled by the engineers that built the built environment for water to flow in our new, more urbanized environment.
Well, firstly, I think we need to view people as part of the ecosystem which we're trying to sustain. And secondly, when we understand perhaps how our cities are growing into wild lands, the question you ask is absolutely right. For those areas which are perhaps untouched now, they're pristine, what's the ecological functions of that part of the landscape which we need to sustain? How big should it be? There's probably migration corridors of birds on flyways. Your orangutans may have a certain range. So first of all, we need to understand that. Secondly, what's more common is that the landscapes which we're looking at have already been heavily disturbed. There's been influence on those landscapes. So the thought that we can actually restore that landscape to some historic condition is incorrect. Because even if you took the people off the landscape, the conditions would not be the same as which those species had evolved. So we need to be smarter. We need to understand what are the key ecological functions that were there historically. Which do we need to replace or sustain in order to maintain that? And then we need the technologies to track how that evolves over time.
We need to be ingenious about it. So, Dr. Josh?
Well, a thought I have, which makes me positive, is that in the past, engineers would design something which maybe they were asked to design by the politicians, and it's very difficult to assess the implications of building a dam, for example. But nowadays we have such sophisticated tools available to predict the impact on the environment before any earth is cut, following the ideas that Peter has been mentioning, the impact on wildlife. We can simulate that. We have such sophisticated tools available. And yesterday, in the opening ceremony, you mentioned Google. We had a keynote address of a sort of a new level of ability for us to collect data, because that's also another issue. Is that in the past, many projects have been built with very little data, very difficult to predict. Mistakes have been made, and I feel we're in an era now where we can have a much better understanding. So we have less excuse, I think, for getting it wrong. Don't you think, Peter?
But I want you to give, maybe after this, the best of discussions that has happened here, so that it gives us more detailed hope for the future. And I want to link it back to education, because if the professors in Malaysia and other countries are still teaching what they learned from their professors before, then how do we even solve the problems in the chaotic future of the 21st century, where some jobs and some problems are not even in existence yet? But we are preparing for it because we know we're changing so many things that we're going to have new stuff, novel ideas and novel problems coming our way. So how do we work that into the academic institutions and learning? We'll discuss that after this short break. Never enough time with great people, and with the executive director and president of AHR even more so. So I'm going to go straight to it. I put quite a lengthy, mouthful question before, but the crux of the matter is we have to be prepared in the 21st century for problems that we've never faced before. I mean, we're going to have more volume of water because by the shelf of the blocks in the Arctic is disappearing. Of course, it's going back to the ocean and stuff like that. So hydrology and hydroscience and engineering is going to be even more pertinent. So from this Congress and moving on forward, this is the best minds in the world in this particular area. Are we anticipating things that we can't ever would have hoped to see before, preparing for the unexpected? And I want to link that straight away to how we teach engineering and hydroscience in our universities right now. If the old professors have instilled to the current professors are going to give that down the line. So where's the new thing for the new 31st century going to come from?
Well, I think you've thrown out an excellent challenge there. And first of all, making new knowledge available quickly. That's exactly the function of IHR. These meetings where you have over 1,200 of some of the top people in the world getting together, not just to give presentations, but to engage in in-depth discussion. What are the priorities? Where are we going? I think the exchange of information, exchange of people around the world is how that happens quickly. I think the acceleration of innovation, we mentioned Google was here just 2 or 3 years ago. You could not look across the world as we saw with water availability or effects on the world's forests instantaneously anywhere in the world. So information is becoming a lot faster. You also asked about engineering education and is that static? I would say every academic here would say we learn a lot from our students as well. So knowledge is advancing so rapidly that the fundamentals don't change. The basic equations don't change. Newton's law doesn't change. But how we use that, how we understand how a complex city like this functions, things are changing very quickly. It's always a challenge to stay on the cutting edge, but it's really the responsibility of professors to make sure that they're teaching the most relevant and new knowledge and allowing their students access to meetings like this where they can meet the top people in their fields.
Dr. George, I was in the UK just last December. I went to 5 key digital economy hubs of the UK because they're preparing for days after Brexit. One of it was at Factory 2050 in Sheffield, which combined precision engineering and big data analytics and stuff. Absolutely science fiction stuff happening right in front of my eyes. The only factory that can be the vendor to both Boeing and Airbus, very competitive rivals, but they hardly have the same vendors. But for this one, because they could engineer and produce maybe a nuts and bolts that's very important to the plane in 18 hours instead of 36. So the world is changing. In the UK, they equate it to the last time we were great as a British Empire, our engineers and engineering was top-notch in the world. So if society in the 21st century were to be on top of what man has also contributed in destroying and changing, we have to go to that high level of excellence. So your input on that?
Well, I think I agree with you. You mentioned, I don't know why you mentioned Brexit, but I believe myself that we have to work together. The world is getting smaller. We have to learn from each other. Just during this one day in the Congress today, I think I've been talking to people from 20 different countries. We have 61 different countries in this Congress. So I think in order to achieve excellence, we have to learn from each other. And over the years I've been working in IHR, I see the barriers to sharing knowledge. I would say they're getting less. 20 years ago, we didn't have things like Facebook, WeChat. Sometimes it's almost too much of a problem, the communicating.
I could understand
it's impossible not to be aware of what's going on elsewhere. So I think your comments about professors learning and the comments of Peter learning from your students, I think it's more difficult nowadays not to be aware of what's happening elsewhere, and that must be, I think, good.
One thing you will take away from this 37th World Congress forever, what would it be?
I think seeing the presentation of our opening keynote speaker, homing in live in Google Earth Engine down to Kuala Lumpur and showing us the satellite images showing subsidence in the surface, to be able to just collect that data and show it to us within seconds, that's quite extraordinary.
Mr. President?
Well, I'll pick something at the total other end of the spectrum, but it just illustrates technology. I was very impressed looking at a consortium between Hong Kong, the European Union, and the US, where they've developed this technology in urban cities for locating pipe leakage. And normally you go in, you have to dig up the road. Correct. It's frustrating because you're driving, you know what it's like. This, you put a pressure wave down the pipe and they can locate where the leak is, how much is leaking, where it's located to within about 5 meters. So you don't need to dig up the whole street. So new technology is coming, it'll change, make your commute a lot easier.
Thank you so much, Professor Goodwin, Dr. George, for making time. Now, IAHR will be a new name that I will not allow to escape from my screens, be it mobile or my PC, because I think there's a lot of knowledge here that the data can be shared across. And I'm going to hunt after your local chapter or representative to make sure that that is done. But on behalf of all Malaysians here, we thank you so much for allowing Malaysia to be the host of your 37th World Congress, and we hope we'll come back here in either individual or organizational form very, very soon. So thank you so much for making time to be on the show.
Well, thank you for your warm hospitality, Malaysia. We've really appreciated it. And thank you for having us and promoting the environment and water.
We'll make sure that you get your King of Fruit durian. You can send in your own views to all the social media platforms that we have, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or download our iOS and Android app. And you can give your critiques and also watch your favorite content like this on your favorite mobile gadget. Good night and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thanks.